Hello students, this module we are going to talk about the ways in which India was understood as an object of study before the institutionalization of sociology. So, the objectives of the module are to delineate the variety of approaches through which India was studied. Secondly, to provide an insight about the categories of people, their role and the purpose of generating knowledge about India, and also to understand the struggles through which the idea of the Indian nation was formed. Now, before the institutionalization of sociology in India around early 1900s, there had been multiple attempts to study India in different ways. These were all pre-sociological in nature, and some of the oldest accounts date back to say 3rd century BC. There were accounts of travelers from Greece, Rome, Jewish travelers and Chinese travelers who came to India and wrote about what they saw when they came. From the 1000 AD onwards, we also had accounts of Arab travelers, the Turks, the Afghans and the Europeans, which are also available as a source of study on India. Most of these accounts were rich geographically, as well as they had certain sociological details as well regarding Indian society. For example, if one were to look at Megasthenes' account, he observed the Indian society and the structure of the Indian society in the urban centers. Similarly, Portuguese people, observers like Duarte Barbosa, learnt an Indian language and produced descriptions which were quite close to the reality of the Indian society around him. Similarly, French travelers like Jean-Baptiste Tavernier provided a history of the reign of Aurangzeb and the commercial activities that were seen in India during that time. Before sociology was institutionalized in the Indian universities as a systematic method of study, we had to rely a lot on accounts of travelers that I have mentioned before. Systematic accounts of India emerged only in the 18th and the 19th century, and these were tied to the imperatives of British rule in India, as we will go on to see. In fact, what I go on to do is to outline 3 kinds of approaches in this particular module, namely the colonial approach, the nationalist approach and the subaltern approach. So, under the colonial approach, there are 3 sources of information about Indian society that is available to us, namely the perspective of the Orientalists, the perspective of the missionaries and the perspective of the administrators. Now, these were the 3 main traditions which developed towards the end of the 18th century, and each of these categories of people wrote about India with a specific purpose in mind. The colonial approach deepened our understanding of Indian society and reflected the fact that the British were interested about India. They were interested in acquiring knowledge about India by learning the classical languages, which would enable an understanding of Indian society, its principles of organization, and it would aid in governance. Now, this is the Orientalist perspective that I am going to talk about in greater detail. This approach took shape after 1757, and here we find that the British people developed a knowledge of Sanskrit, Persian and other vernacular knowledges to read the texts that were available, through which they gained a knowledge about India, about its religion, its philosophy, its history, its art and architecture. I will mention a few important contributors of Orientalist understanding. The first significant person was Alexander Dow. He was an officer with the British East India Company, and he translated the Tarikh-i-Firishtahi, which was published in between 1768 and 1771 as the history of Hindustan. Particularly this text contained descriptions of customs and manners of Indians, prescriptions by Brahmins, accounts of the origins of different castes, the behavior of different castes, and aspects pertaining to sati. Similarly, N.B. Halhed provided the first compilation, which was compilation of Dharma Shastras, and the title was A Code of Gentoo Laws or Ordinations of the Pandits, from a Persian translation made from the original, written in the Sanskrit language, published in 1776. So, the main common aspect in these publications was that all of these writings were written with the help of Brahmin Pandits, and it contained the prescriptions of an ideal society as the Brahmins had thought of. What happened was, the Orientalists believed that these prescriptions would be an accurate guide to the culture and society of the Hindus. This presentation, this kind of belief in the prescriptions of the Brahmins had several implications for developing an understanding of India. What it did was, it placed the Brahmins at the center of the social order, and their interpretations came to be regarded as the norm. Now, the sanctity of Brahmins, the kind of monopoly that they have over knowledge, the kind of prescriptions that they made about the behavior of castes, the behavior of varnas, their roles in society, the nature of hierarchy that one witnessed in Indian society, the differential nature of punishments according to people's varna status, all of these were upheld as authentic knowledge about Indian society. So, this kind of a textual view that was circulated by the Orientalists was considered to be or presented India as a static and as a timeless kind of an entity. Whatever was witnessed by the Orientalists on the ground, in reality was not incorporated in the texts. So, no regional variation, no examples drawing from the actual behavior of the people were incorporated. It is the norms and the prescriptions as articulated by the Brahmins which came to be upheld as an aspect of the Indian sensibility. Therefore, what was Indian society? It was nothing but a set of rules which was followed by all Hindus unequivocally. No, the challenges were not mentioned, it was not witnessed, it did not find its way into the picture of Indian society that the Orientalists presented. Now, the missionary perspective was developed subsequent to the Orientalist perspective, and they had a different goal. Their goal was tied to the idea of social reform of Indian society. In fact, the missionaries thought that the Indian society was debased, it was degenerate, and the prevalent rituals and rites were lowly in character, lowly and superstitious. So, I will go on to talk about the contribution of a few missionary accounts, namely Charles Grant. Charles Grant's observation on the state of society among the Asiatic subjects of Great Britain, particularly with respect to morals and on the means of improving it, was published in 1792, and it was one of the first accounts under the British East India Company whereby a missionary had published an account. Similarly, subsequently William Carey, John Shore, William Ward and other missionaries, they ventured into documenting different aspects of the 19th century society under the perspective of the missionaries. Now, accounts were based on translations of texts which were available in Sanskrit, and what the missionaries tried to do was, they were convinced that Indian society was depraved, that the Hindu religion was depraved, that the only way in which Indian society could be reformed was to do away with Hindu religion. Okay, so the missionaries wanted to strike at the heart of what was considered to be the social basis of Hinduism. They considered Hinduism to be debased and full of superstitions, and they did try to make an empirical contribution to the understanding of Indian society, and this is evident in the publications that they made. For example, William Carey wrote about Bengali language, and it was the first sociolinguistic study of an Indian language, published in 1801, and it was called Dialogues Intended to Facilitate the Acquiring of the Bengali Language. Similarly, William Adams, who came to Bengal as a Baptist minister, he wrote a report on indigenous education, and this report was highly appreciative of the indigenous education that existed in Bengal. Similarly, Robert Caldwell, who went to South India, wrote about comparative grammar of the Dravidian or the South Indian family of languages. And this was a very systematic account of the Dravidian language, and it had an impact on the politics of southern India. Similarly, in 20th century, Charles Andrews and Edward Thompson also documented aspects of Indian society in relation to the rise of nationalism. And as they discovered and wrote about Indian society, they became defenders of the Indian society on the face of British social policy, which was not often appreciated by the British. Now, what was the difference between the Orientalist perspective and the missionary perspective? The Orientalists and the missionaries were considered to be polar opposites in the way in which they approached India. Though there were certain similarities too, they were polar opposites. Now, what were the similarities? The similarities were that both these perspectives agreed on the principles and institutions of Indian society. They felt that Indian society was a society which was religious, and religion permeated all aspects of social life. They were also agreed on the fact that it is the Brahmin who was the sustainer of sacred tradition, and the Brahmin had control over sacred texts. This was the time when the Brahmins were the only ones who could have access to Sanskrit, and since traditional texts were written in Sanskrit, the Brahmin was automatically, they had control over the sacred texts. Now, they believed in the sanctity of the theory of four varnas, Chaturvarnya system, the idea of the origin of castes, and how other castes came into existence through intermixture in marriages. Now, neither the Orientalists nor the missionaries, they tried to relate what they saw on the ground, which was quite different from what was disseminated by the Brahmins. Now, the major difference between the Orientalists and the missionary perspective was that the Orientalists were appreciative of Indian society, whereas the missionaries were disdainful. The missionaries thought that Indian society was corrupt, it was backward, it was superstitious, it required reform, and so on. And Bernard Cohn says that this difference in perspective arose from the kind of backgrounds that these people came from. The Orientalists were better educated. They belonged to the upper classes in Britain, whereas the missionaries were not. So, though the Orientalists were critical of the caste system, they were not interested in changing the caste system as such. The missionaries were primarily the Baptists, and they belonged to the poorer classes in Great Britain, and they wanted to reform the society. They were interested in changing the status quo. They were interested in disseminating Christianity. Let me come to the third aspect of the colonial perspective, and that is the administrative perspective. Now, the administrative perspective developed at a time when the consolidation of the British rule in India was complete, that is, after 1757 and between 1757 and 1785, when the officials of the East India Company felt that they needed to learn about India, know about India. They wanted to create an administrative system which could maintain the law and order, as well as which would be profitable for the creators of this system of bureaucracy. So this was a time when the British consolidated its rule, and with a series of conquests in different parts of the country, they came to be in touch with different varieties of peoples, their history, their systems of land tenure, their religious practices, etc. And this is the time when we come across different accounts by British administrators, namely Colonel Munro's accounts of the Salem district in Madras, land settlements of Salem district, Colonel Malcolm's account of Mysore and the accounts on Marathas, Colonel Todd's account on Rajasthan also emerged during this time. Another source of information, one of the earliest in fact, was led by Dr. Francis Buchanan, who under Lord Wellesley's instructions collected a lot of data on what is understood today as the ethnographic accounts of caste, their various divisions, their occupations, their diversity, the places where they are found, the nature of settlement, the nature of social interaction and so on. But these were not published. In fact, only a part of it was published after his death by different governments who undertook only those parts which pertained to their own region. Now, these accounts by the administrators use the method of surveys, and in these surveys, caste was deemed to be a kind of a measurable entity which had certain specific features, right. So, India was seen to be a collection of castes, and disparate bits of information about its customs, about its traditions, about its religious practices were documented, and it was thought that India had provided Britain with an immense opportunity, as it was a kind of a storehouse. It was a storehouse of primitive beliefs and usages, and the Britishers thought that this was the opportunity to understand the primitive civilization that India represented, because it is through the documentation of knowledges and practices that the British thought would enable an understanding of their own past and an understanding and solution of the problems that Europe faced. And this European civilization was thought to be at a higher stage. In other words, the Indian civilization was seen to be a lower stage of the civilization of Europe, which had travelled to a higher stage. So, if one had to go back to one's past, the Indian civilization provided an opportunity and therefore a vast storehouse of physical and social data, which the administrators then mapped. And this was mapped through by undertaking the census. In fact, the census classified the enormous fluidity that one witnessed on the ground into particular categories, and in the course of doing so, there were numerous contestations and struggles about fixing status, ranks of the Indian people, which was earlier quite fluid in character. As far as the nationalist approach is concerned, it took root over a period of time. It took a span of time to develop the nationalist approach, and it went through several stages. The other important aspect about the nationalist approach is that it was quite uneven and fragmented. There was no one nationalist approach, and it took some time to institutionalize the idea of a nation in the minds of the people. So, though we refer to it as a nationalist approach, in fact, there's a considerable time span through which this approach developed. Now, as far as the nationalist approach is concerned, there were several factors which led to its growth, among which was the growth of the emergence of the printing press, the cultures of assertiveness amongst the vernaculars, and as well as the power of the elite who over a period of time, who would then start questioning the principles of the British and facilitate the growth of nationalism. Now, for example, one of the contributions was, one of the strands of challenges came from the Young Bengal movement. Now, the Young Bengal movement was fascinated by the rationalist ideas that nationalism allowed it to encounter. So, it welcomed the nationalist symbolism in terms of food and dress and meat eating, etc. And it was supposed to be a progressive response to the ways of the British. But the Young Bengal approach was also matched by a conservative reaction from the Indian society, which felt that its identity was in danger. It did not want to subject its own indigenous religious practices to a kind of an open public discussion on the basis of rationalistic principles. So, it fell upon leaders like Bankim Chandra Chattopadhyay to mount a cultural critique of the colonialism's modernizing process and understand the gap between the transformation of Europe, transformation of social life in Europe, and what was being undertaken in India. In order to understand this gap, the leaders like Bankim Chandra had a major role. So, what is significant is that while modernity was attractive to a large section of Indians, English educated Indians, who saw in modernity its own future and a culmination of its own aspirations, it did not remain just a matter of either accepting or rejecting the colonial rule and the changes that were brought about by colonial rule. So, the critique that Bankim Chandra Chattopadhyay and other leaders fashioned was not only directed towards undermining the legitimacy of the colonial power, but it was also directed inwards, in the sense that it was directed towards building the sense of a nation within the Indian people. Now, this bringing into existence of a collective self, of an imagined community, took some time, and it entailed a construction of one's past in particular ways which ordinary people would identify with. And in this construction of Indian past was the picture of the British, which was always negative, right. So, it was not something which was given, it was constructed, and the advent of the Congress and the role of Gandhi had a major role to play in bridging the gap between the English educated elite and the illiterate masses. In fact, the leaders, specifically Gandhi, was responsible for forging a new discourse of nationalism and sharpening anti-colonial dissent amongst the Indian people. Gandhi had a very peculiar way of protest. His acts of defiance were lawful. His politics was also modern. He wrote a number of speeches, articles, he gave interviews in English, and this was meant for the middle class, while for the vernacular elite or for the vernacular, he undertook different forms of protest through prayers, through silences, through satyagraha and so on, which really sort of attracted the people in India. So, if one were to look at the experience of Congress, the Congress was characterized by an infinite variety. It had radical nationalists, it had socialists, it had a brand of Nehruvian socialism within, but what we see subsequently was that this diversity was appropriated within a predominantly Congress past. In fact, as Sudipto Kaviraj says, that the story of the national movement as a whole is a story which was slowly assimilated into the history of Congress. As far as the subaltern approach was concerned, it was articulated by Ranajit Guha, and it developed as a critique of colonial elitism as well as bourgeois nationalism. And this form of they were critical of the form of historiography of the Indian national movement, because they thought that the subaltern perspective, the perspective of the workers, peasants, non-industrial urban poor and lower sections of the petty bourgeois people were not taken into consideration when the freedom struggle was written about. In fact, Ranajit Guha identifies differences between the elite and the subaltern perspectives in particular ways. It says that the politics of the people, which is the subaltern approach, was distinct autonomous domain. And here, as far as the elite politics was concerned, the mobilization was vertical, whereas as far as the subaltern politics was concerned, it was horizontal. Similarly, elite mobilizations drew upon the colonial adaptations of the British institutions, whereas subaltern mobilizations were based on kinship and territoriality. Elite mobilizations were more legalistic and constitutionalist in character, whereas subaltern approaches, forms of mobilization were more violent, and also elite mobilizations were considered to be more cautious, subaltern mobilizations were considered to be more spontaneous. But it is important to remember that despite the differences identified between these two approaches, these two domains, there was a great deal of overlap between the two. And in fact, if one were to understand the national movement, one would witness a complex interweaving of these strands of elite and subaltern politics and forms of mobilization. Therefore, to conclude, I would say that the module tried to highlight the negotiations and processes through which the idea of the nation was formed and how different classes participated in the national movement and in forming an idea of India in the course of the national movement.